I'm super excited about predicting the 2025 theme question for an Inspector Calls because I've got a 95% chance of being right. And the reason for that is the theme is always the same. It's all about social responsibility, which is the same as class, which is the same as a question on the inspector. Let me show you with the thesis statement. So my prediction is that the question will actually be about class. The thesis statement is going to look at Priestley's ideas. I always include 3 ideas because that forces the examiner to automatically expect that I'm going to get at least a grade 8 or 9. And that's genuine. Most students don't write a thesis statement. Those that do put in 1 or 2 ideas and they're automatically at grade 7. So let's have a look. Priestley's first idea is that he wants to expose the capitalist class, the Geralds and the Burlings of the world. And he wants them to accept social responsibility. That's the message that his play is teaching. In order to teach that, he wants to expose these capitalist men, and he wants to show that they naturally exploit workers and women. Here, though, it isn't just men, it's also Sheila and Mrs. Burling who also exploit workers and their own sex, women. That is why Priestley chooses Eva to be female. And then, why does Priestley do that? Because he wants to persuade us that we must pursue socialist and Christian ideas, you'll find that out in the essay, about social responsibility and therefore vote for socialism in 1945. Remember, the play was supposed to be performed just before the election of 1945, which got rid of the Conservative government and replaced it with a socialist government. For AQA, you always get 2 question choices, the character or the theme, and I 100% recommend doing the theme question. And the reason for that is simple. The theme question is always about Priestley's ideas, and when you write about the author's ideas, you're automatically getting grade 7, 8 or 9, unless you forget to keep writing about those ideas in the essay. So this is a much easier question to always get into top grades. Let's now look at what this would look like as a paragraph. Here we have all 3 ideas. Priestley's play carries the didactic message, which means he's teaching, it's didactic, that the wealthy and capitalist classes need to accept social responsibility for those they employ and exploit for profit, sex or satisfaction. Sex involves the women, satisfaction involves what Sheila does and Mrs. Burling does. He wants to persuade his audience in 1945 to vote for a socialist government and reject capitalist thinking. It doesn't take ages to write, and this won't change whatever the question. If the question is about the inspector, you would simply write that the inspector carries Priestley's message. Yeah, it's just exactly the same. Now, if you would like the rest of the essay at grade 9, there is a link in the description. Let's now look at the quotes you will need to structure the rest of the essay. So I'm going to whiz through the 16 quotes. The first thing I want you to notice is that I put them in chronological order. Every time I move through the text in chronological order, I can show how the ideas change. It's a simple trick. Okay, there are 16 quotes. A typical top grade essay has between 13 and 15 quotes in them, but of course some of these quotes are in exactly the same place. So if we look at the inspector's quotes, we are members of one body, we're all responsible for each other, millions and millions of Eva Smiths and John Smiths, they will be taught it in fire and blood and anguish. That's actually really just one big fat quote that I've split up. And because I'm always going to ask you about the ending, no matter what the question and no matter what the text, we'll have quotes from there which are really just one quote. So cognitively, it's not going to be difficult to learn this, but also learn these quotes, the ones that I'm saying come up again and again and again, because they'll fit any essay. The Germans don't want war, says Berling. I'm starting there because it's going to link to Priestley's message that the capitalists have led us to war. So yes, this discredits Berling. It shows that the capitalist class are ignorant. But it also shows that this is an anti-war play, which we'll get to again when we get the fire and blood and anguish. Next we have Mrs. Berling, who says to Sheila, when she's protesting about Gerald having been away on work, "You'll have to get used to that just as I had." Now, I've underlined the word just because it is ironic, because this is not just, it is not fair. It is the patriarchal society that has taught Mrs. Berling it is okay for rich men like her husband to go off and have affairs while they're younger. And the trade-off is you, Sheila, or you, Mrs. Berling, get to marry a rich and influential man. That is an unjust trade-off that society expects, and horrifyingly, Sheila's own mother tells her that she's got to expect it as well. Then we have the words that bring the inspector into the play. A man has to mind his own business. Man, because Priestley is exposing the worst people in this play, who are male, because they are the ones who also sexually exploit Eva, and that contributes much more to her tragedy. Business, the pun on business, because obviously this means just look after yourself, but with Berling and in the play, business also means capitalism and profit. Those are the words that lead to the doorbell ringing, Edna appearing and saying, "An inspector has called." So in a kind of supernatural way, those particular words have caused the inspector to appear from nowhere. He is, if you like, the messenger from Priestley to expose this very idea. There is something deeply wrong with men, particularly capitalist men. There is something deeply wrong with business, and there is something deeply wrong with only caring about your own little circle. Then we have Eric, and he delivers Priestley's message that workers ought to be able to get a share of the profits. The profits only come from the workers' work. Why shouldn't they try for higher wages, he says. We try for higher profits. This is a socialist message. It's not really a message against business. Business should still go out and make money, but business owners should share that money more fairly with the workers. That seems just. These young women counting their pennies, says the inspector. This delivers Priestley's message that Priestley has chosen a victim who is female. He could have picked a John Smith, but picking a John Smith wouldn't have allowed him to show the sexual exploitation. It wouldn't have allowed him to show how society makes choices for women much worse than the choices available to men in 1945 and the years leading up to it. So that's why he focuses on young women. The other interesting thing about this is it will contrast to Mrs. Berling, who talks about them as girls, inferior, not the inspector. He's saying we must treat them as fellow human beings of equal status. And he focuses on pennies to show how little they are left with after their wages. And that is another way of showing that the wages are unjust. Then we have Sheila. You might be said to have been jealous of her. Priestley could invent any reason for Sheila to get Eva sacked, but he picks her vanity, and there are two reasons for this. Number one, he's saying, look, in this patriarchal society where women don't traditionally have paid employment that actually pays well, they don't have careers, well, those women have status which they can only achieve through their looks. Why do they need their looks? In order to attract someone like Gerald. So wealthy women have to attract wealthy partners, so they need to be much more attractive than their competitors. Attractiveness is currency in a world that treats women as commodities to be not quite bought and sold, but close to it. So there's a criticism of the patriarchal role that is given to women in this society. But the second thing is that there is an underlying Christian message to the play. Priestley is using the conventions of the morality play, where vices were given names and characters acted them. So an actor would be jealousy, an actor would be gluttony, an actor would be lust. And I'm not going to go into that if you don't know it, but during this play, each character represents one of the deadly sins, and jealousy is the one that Sheila represents. Why is that important? Because the socialist message of the play is going to be the same as the Christian message of the play. And what Priestley is saying is, look, if you're a Christian, there's no way on earth you can side with the capitalists and vote Conservative. You can only side with the socialists because their principles are the same as a Christian's principles. Next, we have Gerald's language. Gerald's language shows that he is deceitful, and therefore the capitalist classes are deceitful, and they are therefore manipulative. Look at what he says about the rooms that he put Daisy, Eva in. He says, "It happened that a friend of mine went off to Canada and gave me the keys to a nice little set of rooms. It happened that. It was just a coincidence. It just happened to me. I was fortuitous. Not, I noticed my friend was going away to Canada and I said, I really wouldn't mind borrowing those rooms while you were away because I could put a woman in there or several women in there. I could have sex whenever I liked and no one would ever know because she'd be tucked away. And also I'd save loads of money because I wouldn't have to pay prostitutes that I meet at the Palace Bar, and I would get somebody gorgeous who would appreciate me and treat me like a fairy prince because I rescued her from a life of prostitution." Yeah, so he presents that as a complete accident, but Priestley gives him that language to make us suspect it was always his plan. And what is worse, that manipulative plan that Gerald had is actually kinder, fairer than what we later find out Eric does. That is going to be super important when we get to the end of the play. Then we have Mrs. Burling's language, girls of that class. She objects to the idea that Eva could have had any fine feelings. She doesn't believe that the lower classes are allowed the same emotions as the upper classes. This is clearly prejudice. We are invited to really dislike Mrs. Burling, but she represents women of her class, the capitalist class. And in the patriarchal world, women don't get status by being successful in their careers. They get status by being more successful than other women. In other words, her prejudice is encouraged by patriarchal society, not just the class of society. We've already talked about how she dismisses them as girls in contrast to the young women that the inspector calls them. Then we get to Eric. We find out that he forced himself upon Eva, and this is at very least sexual assault. And look how he describes it. I was in that state, not I chose to, this is what I did. This is like Gerald. Oh, I just happened to be in this state. Why? Because I was drunk. That wasn't really my fault. It was the alcohol. It wasn't me. And look how else he says, oh, it's not really my fault. Where a chap easily turns nasty. Yeah, so blokes drink, don't they? They're not nasty. They're just chaps, cheeky chappies, friendly, geezers, you know? And then they easily turn nasty. It wasn't me, it was the alcohol. What happens to anyone who gets drunk? Oh, come on, give me a break. You know, I regret it, I shouldn't have done it, but come on. It wasn't really my fault. So this doesn't just undermine what Eric says, it also undermines men in this society, because that's who Gerald and Eric represent. Remember I said that Gerald, although awful, is still better than Eric. Now we can see why. This is also important because it means we don't fully trust Eric's conversion when he appears to have learned the inspector's lesson. Here's another quote to prove that. When he is told, oh, you stole the £50 then, did you? Eric's reply is, not really. I intended to pay it back. This is self-deception. Even if he does pay it back, it was still theft at the time. But of course, we don't believe he will pay it back. £50 is a hell of a sum, as Burling points out, and he's made no attempt to pay any of it back. He's just spent it. So Priestley presents Eric as an unreliable witness. He is going to repeat the inspector's words, he's going to criticise his family, but this stops us fully believing that that will last beyond tomorrow or beyond next month or next year. It is a temporary lesson. We do not trust that he is going to retain it. That is going to be important at the end of the play. When the inspector leaves, he reiterates all of Priestley's teaching. It's like he goes back to the lesson objectives and says, look, this is what my lesson has been about. Number one, we are members of one body. This language comes directly from communion in church. Why is he using Christian language? Because he is saying, if you are a Christian, and over 80% of the audience would have been, then you have to vote socialist. We are all responsible for each other. That is the socialist message. It is the welfare state which he included Mrs. Burling to expose. She should have looked after Eva through her charity, but she didn't. Well, actually, Priestley is saying it shouldn't be up to women like Mrs. Burling and their charities. It should be something the state does as welfare. Next, we have the millions and millions of Eva Smiths. Notice that Eva Smith comes first. Yes, she represents the working class, which we also get with the John Smiths, but actually Priestley's main focus is women. Why? Not just because society is still unfair to women in 1945, but because they are the ones who have now got the vote, and they are the ones who are dominating his audience. In 1945, most of the men, they're still away at war. They haven't been demobbed yet. And so a feminist message to a female audience is going to be much more powerful. Then the final warning. This is not just an anti-capitalist play, he is saying. This is not just a play about how men exploit women. It's also a play that tells you that capitalism and men have led us to 2 world wars. In 1912, when the play is set, the inspector is saying, look, if we don't change as a society, war is inevitable. Fire and blood and anguish. And Burling is completely wrong. It's not only the Germans who want war, it's the rich men in England and the United Kingdom. Priestley's message in 1945 is, we've just had 2 world wars, there will be a third if you keep electing the same kind of people. Who are those people? They are represented by Gerald. That is why at the end of the play, Gerald's words summon the next phone call, the next inspector, just like Burling's words summoned the original inspector. What does he say? He says, how about this ring? He wants Sheila to take him back, to get the engagement back on course. Not because he hasn't done anything that he shouldn't, far from it, but simply because it's not going to come out in a public scandal because the inspector was a hoax. Gerald clearly has learned nothing. Look at the pun of ring. What about this ring, he says, and the telephone, ring, 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 ring. It's almost funny, but it shows us the supernatural element of the play again, as though there is a God or something listening that is listening to how these people behave and responding. The universe or God or fate, however you want to frame it, will not accept this sort of capitalist behaviour, and the play is there to change it. But now, look at Sheila's response. She doesn't say, on your bike, mate, there's no way I'm taking you back after what you've done and how you've refused to accept the lessons that the inspector has taught. No, she says, not yet. This is a huge hint that in the future she'll take him back. Why? Why would she do that? Because this is a patriarchal society and women's choices are completely limited. Not so the women's choices in 1945. 1912, they had no vote, they had no status, they couldn't have careers. In 1945, most of the women are at work. They're in paid employment and many of them are in successful employment. They are in careers and they do not want to give that back to the men who are returning from war. How are they going to preserve their status and to get some influence in society? They're going to vote for a socialist government. That is Priestley's message. So we can see when we get to the ending that Priestley is pessimistic. We might think that if Sheila had learnt the lesson and Eric had learnt the lesson, they would inherit and they would metaphorically be able to change wider society as they would be able to change the Burlings. But no, that doesn't happen. That's why we get the new phone call, the new inspectors coming. And that gives us the massive clue that Eric, Mr. Denial, Mr. Make Excuses for himself, is not going to have learned the inspector's lesson. Sheila, oh yeah, she learned it, but she's powerless because she's a woman in 1912. That contrasts with the women in 1945. Well, I hope you're super excited about that and you're thinking, yes, I could write this essay, no bother at all. If you would like to read the entire essay, it's linked in the description, but I'm trying to make a bit of dosh there, so you might not want to pay me anything for the essay, in which case, no worries. Because the next video is going to be about the character I predict, and you can write about that as well, or instead. But you know what I would do? Theme question every time.